Hello, my name is Oliver Bell from Newcastle United Foundation. Thank you for joining me in my baby's nursery. The perks of working from home, I suppose. I am the Health and Wellbeing Manager at Newcastle United Foundation. So we are the charity that runs alongside of the football club. And part of my role is to overlook a campaign called Be a Game Changer, which is a mental health campaign trying to change the culture of mental health and mental health conversations within the Northeast. And one of the things of which, or one of the ways of which we do that is by going out and delivering things on subjects such as stress and anxiety. So that's why I've recorded this video, is to try and give you a little bit of support during these times within the NHS with some of the learnings that I've had. Now, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a health professional, but what I do know is a little bit of background around what stress is, around how that might impact people's anxieties, and how ultimately that might lead to a mental health condition. So hopefully I will show you just a couple of bits of tricks and tips around how you might be able to control your mental health during situations which we're in today. So first of all, stress. Stress is a biological mechanism, so it's designed to try and keep us safe. So stress, if we think of it within the body, or occasions of when we get stressed and what happens within the body, your heart starts to beat faster. Now, your heart's beating faster because your body's releasing something called adrenaline. Adrenaline makes the heart beat faster, it makes blood go around the body quicker, it makes the blood carry the oxygen around the body quicker because the breathing rate is increasing. It starts to turn things off within the body, things like your digestive system, and it starts to turn things off like your immune system. Now, the reason why it does these things is because stress is a mechanism to try and keep us safe. So if we think of 50,000 years ago when humans were wandering around the Serengeti and we stumbled across something like a saber-toothed tiger, a threat, something which posed a threat to us. Now, our bodies would start to do all of these things to try and keep us safe. It would increase the heart rate and the breathing and the oxygen in the body because we need to be ready to either run away or we need to be ready to fight. It's the fight or the flight system. And it also switches the immune system off and switches the digestive system off because there's no point me digesting food to try and keep me alive in the next 2 weeks. And there's no point me trying to fight off germs and diseases if I'm going to die in the next 2 weeks, if I'm going to try and, which might endanger me in the next 2 weeks. So it switches these things off to try and protect me in that situation. Now, that's great, and that can be really useful if we're wandering around the Serengeti, or it might be really useful in small doses. So, for example, if you had an exam or if you had something coming up and that stress motivated you. But if stress occurs multiple times a day, and if we don't control it, then it can sometimes spiral and it might lead to some things like anxiety. Okay. Now, anxiety could be thought of as it could be a buildup of stress. Now, people have got different types of anxieties. Anxiety is this umbrella term, and underneath anxiety fits loads of different types of disorders. Now, if we think of anxiety as exhibiting the similar sort of symptoms and the way of which it manifests itself in the body is very similar to stress in that heart rate tends to be elevated, breathing rates can be elevated during things like panic disorders and panic attacks. And that's because it's very similar to stress. Now, anxiety, I was listening to a podcast the other day actually, and I'll put a link on this around how anxiety is increased even more so during situations like what we're dealing with now. And the person was talking about he was a psychologist from America, and he was talking on a podcast by David Lowe, who's a ex-athlete, and he also does these podcasts called The School of Greatness. And they were discussing about how anxiety is becoming quite contagious, just as much as contagious as what COVID-19 is at the moment. And the reason is because anxiety can be made up of fear, and fear can be good. As I mentioned before, if we're fearful in the Serengeti, if we're fearful of that thing coming towards us, then our bodies are going to keep ourselves safe. We're going to run away, and we'll learn from that, and we'll know not to go back there again. But if fear is mixed in with uncertainty, and we don't know what's coming in the future, then that's what leads to anxiety. And that's what COVID-19 is that we're scared, we don't know what's happening, we don't know what's coming, and we don't know the answers. And all of those mixed in together can be really quite difficult for us to control. And that might be what leads to some people's anxieties. So how do we control these things? What sort of things can we do to try and limit the amount of anxiety, the amount of stress that we're experiencing? Well, there's a tool that I use quite regularly in some of my sessions, and it's called the stress container. So the stress container is I learned from Mental Health First Aid England. So they are the guys who proposed this to me first of all, and I've kind of used it in these sessions, and I suppose taken it a little bit, which maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't have done. But within the stress container, if you think of it as a bucket or a vessel, and you can start to list all of the things in your life which stress you out. So you can write down as many different things in this bucket or this vessel as you possibly can. Now, it's really useful to write down the really small things to the really big things. So I've got things like burning the toast. So on a morning, you've burnt the toast, you're late for work, and that's really going to stress you out. Okay. But then it might also be things like your own health, or it might be things like the unknown, like I mentioned before. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID-19. We don't know what to expect, and that can be really quite stressful for us. Or it might be dealing with death. So dealing with things on your day-to-day basis where you see some horrible things, and that can be really quite detrimental to your mental health and to your stresses. Now, the point of writing these things down is twofold. The first one is that if we can start to list the things that we do in our life that can let these things out of the container. So if you think of these as coping mechanisms or helpful coping mechanisms, and this is the tap of which we can turn when we do these helpful coping mechanisms to let things out of our container, then you can start to reduce the amount of things in our container. So I've just written a few things down that I do. So including things like exercise, meditate. At the moment, NHS staff have access to things like Headspace and Calm, which are two apps, and they've offered all of their services for free for those within the NHS. And I would recommend that people give those a go. And you might be sat there going, well, I've not got time to get a yoga mat out and light incense sticks and to really get in touch with my deeper inner sense. Now, that's not necessarily what these apps do. They're not necessarily your traditional meditation, but it's more mindfulness. So if you think of it as trying to ground yourself in the here and the now and to try and understand what's happening inside of your body, that can start to reduce all of the other thoughts that are going on in your head, which may be those things inside of your stress container. So give mindfulness a go, give those apps a go. I've also written things like podcasts. I've already mentioned a podcast that I've listened to, which has helped me to understand a little bit more around why people are becoming so much more anxious during times like those that we're living in now. So give those a listen to. And books. I've also started reading a lot more books just to try and take my mind off things that are happening in the everyday. Now, that's one good way of what we can, or one good thing that we can deduce from this stress container is the things that we can do to try and reduce the things in our stress container. But there may also be other things. We may also look at the lists of the things that are stressing us out inside of our container, and we might be able to reduce or remove a few of these things. Burning the toast, for example. Now, if I burn the toast, I am reacting to that in a certain way, which is stressing me out. Now, if you don't really know what I mean by that, now, I remember reading a book by Derren Brown, the magician, and he was talking about Stoic philosophy. And I'm not a Stoic philosopher. I don't really know much about Stoic philosophy, and I only took a little bit from this book, but it kind of resonated with me and it stuck with me quite a lot. And he said in this book that we can categorize things in life. We can put things into two categories, and they're the things that we can control and the things that we can't control. And with Stoic philosophies, they say that we can control our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, and our emotions. So I can only control me. Everything else I cannot control. I can't control those things. So should I really let them stress me out? Should they really be something that gets on me and adds to my container? Now, taking the toast burning, for example. If I've burnt the toast, I can't control the toast and its current state and the fact that I've burnt it around the outside, but I can control the way in which I react to that burnt toast. I also give another example, which might not be as relative now because at the moment this isn't really happening as much, but traffic used to stress me out. If I was in the road, in the car, and I saw a series of a series of red, yellow, and green lights, and it was always on red, that would really, really wind me up. But I learned that if I can change the way of which I react to those things, if I can change my thought patterns, then I can start to reduce those stresses and reduce those biological things that are going in my body, like my heart beating faster and my breathing getting quicker and my adrenaline and cortisol rushing around my bodies, which may create some sort of physical health issue in the future. If I can reduce all of that just by changing the way in which I react to those red lights, then maybe I can take something out of my container. But it may also be useful to look at other things in our container and things that are probably, it'll be probably very difficult for us to try and change our mindset on. So thinking about like our own health, for example, or the unknown, what's going to happen, these things which are stressing us out, or dealing with death. They're things that are going to be really, really tricky to try and apply that technique which I've just mentioned. But that's where external help can come in. Now, as an employee within the NHS, you will probably have access to quite a lot of services at this time. Okay, you will probably have access to various different online training, or it might be face-to-face counselling. Now, don't be sat there thinking, well, there's no way that I would do counselling. That's not like me. I've not got a mental health issue. Now, don't think of it as if you access counselling, you have to have a mental health issue. That's not the case whatsoever. Think of it as training your brain. Okay. Now, for years and years, I used to go to a gym and I used to pay for a gym and I used to train my body so that my physical health was as best as it possibly could be. But then I realized, well, what am I doing for my mental health? What sort of things am I doing to try and keep my mental health as positive and as healthy as what it possibly can be? Now, accessing counselors and speaking to people who are completely impartial to your life and people who can really offer you some insights into how you might be able to reduce these things in the lighter purple from your stress container can be really, really useful. And it's really important that you do that in times like now, because you need to look after you. If you don't look after you, you're not going to be able to look after everybody else. Okay? We've got to look after us first, because if we don't look after us, we're not going to be as good at looking after other people. So it's so important that you look after you. Okay? So I suppose that kind of brings me to the end of my little bit of a talk for you guys. I've just looked at my notes. I've got one more thing that I want to mention, and it goes back to the social contingency, or the contagiousness of anxiety when it comes to social side or social media. Now, we're currently living in a time where the only things that pop up on the news and the only things that are in our news feed is COVID-19. And that can become really, really depressing after a while. And if we're constantly just being fed all of this negative information, we're going to really, really create a detrimental part to our mental health. Now, it's funny that all of a sudden I wake up and I'm looking at these graphs and looking at these line graphs, and I'm trying to figure out whether or not we've reached the top of the curve or whether or not we're underneath Italy in this curve and all this sort of stuff. And everybody on Twitter is a complete expert in sort of epidemiology and a virologist and all these sorts of things. And really, it's just Bob down the road who's on Facebook or Twitter. And that can be really quite detrimental. Okay, it can be really quite damaging towards our mental health. So if you can, try and limit your exposure to things like social media and things like the news. Try and limit yourselves to that, because it's not going to be very helpful at times like these. Okay. As I said, that's all I wanted to talk to you about, really. Please do access some of those offers that I've just mentioned within this little talk around the Headspace app, the Calm app, some of the service that you can get hold of through occupational health and other things within the trusts. Give those a go, please do. If you feel like you want some more support from us, from the foundation, we've got a Facebook group called Be a Game Changer. Please access that if you can. We've got loads of different tips and bits of advice and methods of which we try and support people as best we can. But hopefully, look after yourselves, keep going, you're doing really well. Thank you.